But even more so, to say that it is not acceptable, morally acceptable to the people of the United States is potentially a very significant empirical issue, because you're basically making a claim about people's moral values, right? Now, one response to Justice Marshall would have been to say, well, if that's true, then why do you need to strike this down? Because if the majority is opposed to the death penalty, then legislatures will get rid of it and Congress will get rid of it. And you can imagine the counter-arguments to that. Sometimes politics is very hard to work, and just because a majority supports something in the abstract doesn't mean you get it, right? For years, there's been data that majorities would support, for instance, national health care, but for decades we didn't get that. So politics could be an explanation. Nonetheless, Marshall was making a claim about majority sentiment in the United States that opened itself very much to a potential empirical refutation. The second justice from this group of people who justices that would have struck it down completely, the death penalty, in 1972, the great William O. Douglas, I think the longest-serving Supreme Court justice, one of the longest-serving in history. He was appointed by President Roosevelt in 1939, and he served until 1975. He was a very important justice in that regard because he came on the court during the New Deal at a time when the Supreme Court was basically under attack by the New Deal itself for being too willing to strike down state and federal legislation. So he's part of a generation of justices that were fairly deferential to state power. And yet he had decided the death penalty is something that the court could reach out and strike down. So that, from that point of view, that was very significant, in a sense, defection from the New Deal deference wing of the court to being fairly willing to use the Constitution to strike down majority or possibly majority institutions. The interesting thing about Douglas is that he did focus on race. And the other thing I meant to say about Justice Marshall is that he did not, right? You might have expected Thurgood Marshall, who argued Brown versus Board of Education in the Supreme Court, to argue that the real problem with the death penalty in America is that it's tainted by racial prejudice, or that it's so embedded in popular decision-making that even if it's not always tainted with racial discrimination, it can't be guaranteed to not be. You can't purge the taint completely from the system. And yet, he seems to almost go out of his way to avoid that argument. And I think there is some irony there. Of course, he might have felt that it was less legitimate for him as a lifetime advocate of equal rights for minorities to be the main one to express that view. And you might assume, or might think that he took some comfort in essentially basing his argument on majority values, sort of saying, I've spent my whole career fighting for minority rights. Here I want to say that let's get rid of the death penalty because it's not compatible with we the people in the majority, not just in our desire to protect minorities. So it fell to Justice Douglas to argue that capital punishment is unconstitutional, he said, if it's imposed by reason of race. And he went on to say, or even a procedure that gives room for the play of such prejudices. But I want to spend a little more time on the third justice in the trio. And I want to sort of anticipate Thursday a little bit here by suggesting to you that Justice Brennan, in his concurrence, in his vision of how the death penalty had come to be unconstitutional and unsalvageable, offers us a different and in some ways, I think, more robust approach to abolition that may have new strength today, which is why I want to come back to it, even though the great justice has now been dead over 15 years. One of our very most productive justices wrote some of the most important decisions of the Warren Court, and his focus, although he agreed with Justices Marshall and Douglas and signed their opinions as well and endorsed their views in his own opinion, if you read his opinion, and you can get it, I'll make sure there's a link up. Actually, if you just Google Furman versus Georgia, there's a variety of ways to read the opinions. I happen to like the Cornell University site because it lets you read the separate opinions in a very clear way, either in HTML or in PDF. And I will put a link to that website, the Cornell website, up on our resources page. But Brennan focused on the dignity, what I'm going to call the dignity argument, that the death penalty violates the Eighth Amendment for a variety of reasons, but especially because it alone among contemporary forms of punishment is, quote, uniquely degrading to human dignity. Just a telegraph I want to get to on Thursday, I think that's an argument that Brennan was ahead of the curve in recognizing the power of, and that survives the unfortunate explosion of backlash politics that pretty much gutted certainly Justice Marshall's arguments, if not Justice Douglas's. So let's look a little bit more at Brennan's argument. In an interesting way that will resonate with our studies up to now, Brennan notes that the United States has been quite similar to the other countries of the world in debating the moral status of the death penalty. Right? So in the United States, as in other nations of the Western world, the struggle about this punishment has been one between ancient and deeply rooted beliefs in retribution, atonement, or vengeance on the one hand, and on the other beliefs in the personal value and dignity of the common man that were born of the democratic movement of the 18th century. So he's saying, look, there's a common foundation that's been building for a couple of centuries now with the argument of dignity relevant potentially to both sides, to those concerned about retribution and atonement and the victim, but also to those concerned about the potentially degrading qualities of execution. So he's not denying that dignity might once have been compatible with the death penalty. He points out that when we look at our own history, and this is history we've now studied, we don't see an unchanging institution, but one that has changed constantly and in a distinctive direction. He writes, although this country never embraced the more violent and repulsive methods employed in England, for instance, there was no dissection, there was no hanging in chains here in the United States, we did for a long time rely almost exclusively upon the gallows and the firing squad. Since the development of the supposedly more humane methods of electrocution late in the 19th century and lethal gas in the 20th, however, hanging and shooting have virtually ceased. So he's noting that there's an evolution in the way the death penalty is carried out. And again, he notices the change from public to private executions. Our concern for decency and human dignity, moreover, has compelled changes in the circumstances surrounding the execution itself. Today, we reject public executions as debasing and brutalizing to us all. So he begins to make the case that although he says the death penalty has been employed throughout our history, that is not a reason to view it as permanently legitimate. It's, in fact, undergoing change, but not a change that suggests evolution so much as a change that suggests the evolution of our consciousness. That is, the death penalty remains a problem, but it's becoming a more and more acute problem of humanity over time. And this is where he gets to his key argument here. After especially comparing the death penalty to prison, a form of penalty that really didn't exist in its mature form at the time of the framing of the Eighth Amendment, he writes, the calculated killing of a human being by the state involves, by its very nature, the denial of the executed person's humanity. An individual in prison does not lose, quote, the right to have rights. A prisoner remains a member of the human family. And he goes on to say he can be protected in terms of not being punished cruelly inside prison, rights to free expression of religion, etc. The prisoner remains a member of the human family. In comparison to all other punishments today, then, the deliberate extinguishment of human life by the state is uniquely degrading to human dignity. Now, I hope to flesh out this dignity argument a little bit more on Thursday, but it's something that we're going to visit again at the end of the course when we think about dignity in the prison. But I just want you to notice now some of the ways in which this dignity argument does not suffer from the vulnerabilities of the other arguments we've seen. For one thing, it's not an empirical argument, right? It doesn't say that the death penalty doesn't deter as well as life imprisonment. although his argument might be different if we knew conclusively that the death penalty did deter more effectively than life imprisonment. But certainly in a climate where we're not sure whether one deters or not any more effectively, these dignity arguments don't turn on deterrence. They turn on the inherent inhumanity of treating somebody as not even having the right to have rights, as Justice Brennan puts it here. Secondly, this is not an argument that turns on majority moral sentiments. Our commitment to the rule of law and to dignity is not one that depends on our feeling good about the individuals that we end up conceding we must treat as human beings. In fact, the reason we have to be concerned with humanity is when our basic desire to torture them or do other things to get information from them, etc., is very acute indeed. Well, I'm not going to give a full treatment to the dissents, although they're very interesting as well. I'm going to focus on one in particular, and that was Justice William Rehnquist. He's a very interesting justice at this moment in history. First of all, he's just been appointed to the Supreme Court at this point. Notice the first 1972. He's appointed by President Nixon. Unlike all the other members of the Supreme Court at this point, who are basically personally opposed to the death penalty, including Justices Berger and Blackmun, who vote to uphold the death penalty but feel that it's not an appropriate role for the court. Rehnquist is somebody who's personally favorable to the death penalty, and he's also somebody who's much more committed to the view that courts ought to be very deferential not only to the framers of the Constitution and their original intent, but also to the limited role of courts in a democratic society primarily governed by legislative action. He writes about the death penalty that it is a penalty that our nation's legislatures have sought necessary since our nation was founded. And I think it's a very economical critique of the Supreme Court there, the majority, because he's highlighting at least three different things there. One, that the death penalty is very traditional, and therefore if the Constitution is supposed to preserve tradition, it seems bizarre that we should use the Constitution to eliminate the death penalty. Secondly, that this is the court usurping what would maybe normally be seen as a legislative role, making a policy decision. But thirdly and subtly, in this one word, necessary, pointing toward the problem of crime and the concern that crime, which was certainly perceived and was in many ways out of control in America in 1972, would be viewed as something that ought to influence the Supreme Court's thinking about this. And in the full Gregg opinions, which I have not given you, you may feel like I gave you enough, but if you read the entire Gregg opinions, you'll see a lot of justices there, including Rehnquist and Scalia. Scalia's not on the court then, but including some of the other justices do make reference to the homicide rate and to the fear of crime, which is very prevalent in America at this point. Now, Furman versus Georgia left the door open, at least an inch, to the death penalty's return. The death penalty was struck down, but three members of the court had said that they would leave the death penalty intact, Justices Rehnquist, Berger, and Blackmun. And two other members of the court, Justices Stewart and White, had said that the death penalty could be potentially repaired, right? So that meant there were five justices who potentially would find some death penalty, a modified one, constitutional. And that brings us to the backlash that occurred next. Within literally weeks of the Furman decision, some state legislatures actually came back into session on an emergency basis to pass new death penalty laws. 5 states, as I put here in the bullet point, announced their intention to reauthorize capital punishment within a day after the decision. By the time of the Gregg decision in 1976, 35 states had reenacted the death penalty. And in California, where the California Supreme Court had struck down the death penalty on the state constitutional grounds just before Furman, a popular initiative had returned the death penalty, overruled the Supreme Court, and amended the California Constitution by a nearly 2-to-1 vote. And I put Ronald Reagan up here because he was governor of California at the time, and he certainly became a champion of the view that the Supreme Court had usurped its role and was endangering ordinary citizens by removing a potentially important tool of law enforcement against criminal violence. And again, remember this is happening at a time when the homicide rate, especially in California, is still growing up. The cases that were on the minds of the public in 1972 involving the death penalty in California would have included Charlie Manson, would have included Sirhan, the assassin of Robert Kennedy. And as a result of the Furman decision, some 540 people, all the people on death row in America at that time, had their sentence automatically commuted to life in prison with parole. Now, in those days, parole meant you could be paroled typically within 7 years. California, that was the 7 years you could be out on parole. So the image that Manson and people like Manson would be on the streets of California within 7 years, say by 1979, seemed very palpable to lots of people. So very dramatic. This is about as big a political backlash as any Supreme Court decision has generated, except maybe Dred Scott, which is considered to have led to the Civil War. This wasn't quite a Civil War in some ways because it was too one-sided, right? You had 35 states reenacting the death penalty within a several-year period, a very strong and resounding rejection of what the Supreme Court had done. Now, after having thought about the structure of the Furman decision the way we have carefully done in the last hour, I think you could, even if you hadn't read the 20 pages of excerpts, and that's excerpts that I gave you from the Gregg opinion, and please, if you haven't read those, take a look at them this evening, because we'll keep talking about this tomorrow. It's not surprising what happened next, right? If the claim is, there are seem to be two claims on the table, they kind of put Justice Brennan to the side. One claim is that the death penalty is not in line with American values. Another claim is that the death penalty is too arbitrary and capricious. Well, you've just had 35 states reenact the death penalty in this almost explosion of popular enthusiasm for the death penalty. You've had juries hand down over 500 death sentences just in the 4 years since some of them have come back before you get to the Supreme Court in Gregg. So to the extent that Justice Marshall had said the death penalty offends the moral values of the American people had seemingly just said, you're wrong to him. Now, his rejoinder in Gregg is to say, well, they don't know what they're talking about. If people only knew the reality of the death penalty, they'd be opposed to it. Now, people tried to test that hypothesis, and it's very difficult to show that that's true. But in any event, the argument that the death penalty is not in line with American values seemed to be gone at this point, very decisively so. Secondly, if you think that the problem with the death penalty is that it's too arbitrary and capricious, that there's no good way to explain why one person gets the death penalty and another person doesn't, then the new statutes that had come before the court in Gregg looked very promising. I just want to run through some of the elements of those that are noted in the Gregg decision, the elements that the excerpts I had you read. So one important innovation in the statutes that they upheld, and they did strike down others, was the bifurcated procedure. Traditionally, when you were on trial for first-degree murder, you would present the evidence of guilt and innocence, and then the jury would decide on whether you were guilty or not, and on whether you deserve to be executed or not at the same time. Now notice the problem there. If your defense is, I was in Chicago, and that's the whole defense you put on, and the jury thinks you're lying, they believe other witnesses that say you were in Berkeley, you weren't in Chicago, so you could have done it. Now they think you're a murderer and a liar, and whatever defenses you might have had, like, well, the guy came at me, or I have mental illness problems that make me very vulnerable to being scared of people who attack me or yell at me, whatever defense you might have, you don't get to present those, because you were too busy arguing you were in Chicago, or you were forced to choose between those arguments. Bifurcating solves that problem. Now you can go forward with your best guilt phase issue, as we would call it. And then if you lose, you may be pushing your luck with the jury, but you can fall back on the I had a terrible childhood defense after they decide you were in Chicago or weren't in Chicago. We'll come back later on Thursday to some of the problem with making that kind of argument. But bifurcation looked like it would work there. Secondly, statutory narrowing. First-degree murder statutes basically say, did the person kill another person, and did they kill that person under circumstances that show a deeply malevolent mind, either because they premeditated the killing or because it was done in the course of a felony, like a robbery or a rape. So that is one way of narrowing. You can't execute any killer. They have to be guilty of first-degree murder. But as you can see, that's just one consideration, and it's one that might be very difficult for the jury to decide. How do you know when somebody's premeditated? Do they have to have time to plan? Well, not necessarily, according to the courts. So the new statutes, borrowing from the Model Penal Code, essentially a law reform proposal that had been developed in the 1950s, the new statutes introduced a whole set of what were often called aggravating features. So they basically said, look, you have to convict the person of first-degree murder, and then on top of that, you've got to show that at least one of these factors that make a killing even more heinous, more culpable, more troubling. You did it in the course of a violent robbery. You've done it before. You did it while you were in prison, serving a life sentence. Or you've committed a violent felony in the past. You killed more than one person at a time. You endanger a bunch of people. So, I'm trying to shoot him in the back, but I spray the room and maybe wound other people, right? So all of those are kind of factors that could make a death penalty more worthy. Finally, and I'll leave it at this, an automatic appeal to the state's highest court. Traditionally, states, of course, you had a right to appeal to the state Supreme Court, but they did not necessarily have to take your appeal. I'm going to just kind of stop right there rather than rounding off to conclusion, because I will pivot and look at the post-grade death penalty and its potential future on Thursday.